Hey guys! Tonight we step into the bizarre world of Louis the Fourteenth, the Sunday king hailed as the most beautiful monarch in Europe, who captivated foreign ambassadors with his perfect physique and could dance ballet for 6 hours straight without breaking a sweat. You wouldn't survive a glimpse of the same king who once remembered the names of 3,000 nobles reduced to a 310-pound mass of gangrenous flesh, completely toothless. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let us first review the glorious life of Louis the Fourteenth, before turning to the tragic twists that illness brought upon him. Born in 1622 and crowned at the age of 5 after his father's untimely death, Louis the Fourteenth swiftly proved himself not merely heir to the throne but architect of absolute power. He styled himself the Sunday King, a symbol of illumination across Europe, and reigned for nearly 72 years, becoming the longest-serving monarch in Western history. From his earliest days as regent, Louis demonstrated an unrelenting ambition to concentrate authority in the crown. In 1662, after the passing of Cardinal Mazarin, he declared, "I am the state," and proceeded to strengthen a loyal administrative cadre while ruthlessly suppressing all rival factions. Under his leadership, France's legal and bureaucratic systems were overhauled, marking a turning point from feudal lords to a modern, centralized absolute monarchy. Not content merely with politics, Louis the Fourteenth became a preeminent patron of the arts. He endowed the Royal Academy of Painting, recruiting Europe's leading artists such as Charles Le Brun to create the sumptuous Louis XIV style, distinguished by blazing gold palettes and grandiose compositions. Playwright Molière, Jean Racine, and composer Jean-Baptiste Lully all received generous royal funding to produce works that defined the era. At the Palace of Versailles, Louis hosted thousands of ballets, concerts, and poetry readings, demonstrating that France's dominance extended beyond the battlefield into the realm of culture. Versailles itself evolved from a modest hunting lodge into a magnificent palace, beginning in 1664. Louis commissioned thousands of marble columns, hundreds of paintings, and mirrored walls reflecting a star-dappled ceiling. The gardens spanned hundreds of hectares, complete with fountains, a sun god obelisk, an opera house, and even a Japanese garden. Every walkway and fountain was meticulously planned to reflect the unrivaled authority of the Sunday King. On the diplomatic front, Louis expanded France's borders through the wars of Lorraine, Flanders, and the 9 Years' War. His formidable army struck fear into neighboring sovereigns, while he skillfully forged temporary alliances to maintain the European balance of power. Envoys from Venice, England, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire approached Paris in awe of its solemn etiquette and breathtaking ceremonial splendor. In his personal life, Louis XIV was famed as a consummate bon vivant, maintaining intimate liaisons with at least 12 noble women each month. These relationships served as conduits into courtly factionalism and shaped the Sun King's image as both a virile ruler and a patron of refinement. His son, Philip, was trained meticulously to succeed him, though he never matched his father's political stature. Yet behind the palace's gilded facade and resounding military victories, Louis gradually revealed physical frailties. At the age of 25, he began suffering from chronic constipation, requiring daily enemas to maintain any semblance of regularity. Confidential court documents record that he sometimes needed 2 to 3 enemas each day, an early warning sign of his compulsive overeating, which saw him consume 6 to 8 meals daily. Ranging from buttery breads and fresh fish to the finest wines, his health decline was compounded by a strict regimen of only washing his hands and face each morning, believing that full-body bathing would weaken him and admit evil spirits, an extreme medieval notion that left his skin grease-laden, acne-scarred, and his breath so foul that courtiers wore perfumed masks. Hand mirrors and hand fans became indispensable at court. Louis's weight skyrocketed from 165 pounds in 1670 to 310 pounds by 1710. His ornate armour and royal robes had to be tailored twice as large, and his once confident steps faltered under the burden of gangrenous ulcers at his knees and feet. The agony of gout, coupled with chronic hemorrhoids and a fistula, gradually turned the Sunday King into a shadow of his former self. In summary, Louis the Fourteenth was not only the legendary sovereign who built the French Empire and ushered in a golden age of civilization, but also a stark example of the human body's fragility, even when wielding absolute power. He once conquered battlefields and enthralled ambassadors with his talents and beauty, only to be finally felled by 6 silent enemies: constipation, chronic ulcers, obesity, halitosis, gangrene, and alcoholism. We will next explore in depth the extraordinary medical treatments and nightmarish procedures Louis endured, stories steeped in tragedy and lessons vital to our own lives today. Let us begin our journey into one of the most horrifying secrets few dare to speak of: Louis the Fourteenth's habit of refusing full-body bathing. From his youth, he embraced the medieval belief that water would weaken the body and open doors to evil spirits. With that ironclad conviction, each morning Louis washed only his hands and face, leaving the rest of his body coated in layers of sweat, street dust, and countless bacteria accumulated overnight. Once that decision became an unchangeable routine, the consequences emerged swiftly. Whispers spread throughout the palace of Versailles about the royal breath, so overpowering it was unbearable. Louis was forced to keep peppermint candies in his mouth at all times to mask the odour. The council chamber floors were strewn with dried mint leaves as a temporary defence against the relentless stench. At the slightest breeze rustling a curtain, waves of that foul odour would surge forth, making anyone nearby gasp for air. Beneath layers of high-end white powder and rouge, his skin grew slick with oil, and acne erupted like clusters of thorns across his face. Every attempt to conceal it with powder only heightened the contradiction, an opulent exterior masking a roiling bacterial ecosystem beneath. Courtiers nicknamed him the King of Masculine Musk, while foreign envoys dared not enter his private audience chamber without donning perfumed masks. Shame and embarrassment seemed to have no impact on the king's mind. He stubbornly clung to the belief that he was God's chosen, and that washing only hands and face was sufficient to receive the divine light. In Louis's view, bathing the entire body would degrade his royal dignity and contradict the self-divinization he had so painstakingly cultivated. While all of Europe marveled at Versailles' grand ceremonies and lavish architecture, a few realized that the very palace was also a breeding ground for disease. Under the glow of incense-scented lamps and the accompaniment of sumptuous orchestras, the halls exuded the aroma of grease, fermenting sweat, and the weary mint meant to fight it. Every corridor and reception room carried a trace of that pungent odour, an unspoken warning none dared openly confront. Yet Louis's power was so great that no one dared criticize his natural moisture retention. Despite the obvious health repercussions, royal physicians could only shake their heads and look away. For any public censure risked charges of treason or severe punishment. Instead, Versailles instituted colour-coded ceremonial protocols and mandated perfumed masks, a system designed to mask an unchangeable defect. The king's psyche grew ever more complex with each passing day. He reminded himself that he was an immortal symbol of authority. Yet deep inside, shame bled through every breath of that foul odour. When alone in his private chambers, Louis would often stare into a mirror and ask himself, "To what extent have I sacrificed my body for power?" Though called the Sunday King, his flesh had become a decaying shadow beneath layers of metal armour and luxurious fabric. Rich fragrances were burned throughout the palace, in an attempt to mask the truth, but they could not muffle the soft crackle of spreading pustules or the dripping sound of soaked dressings being removed. Louis felt itching at his feet, his back, his upper arms as if every bacterium in his body was staging a revolt. He gripped the armrest in a desperate bid to continue issuing his royal commands. By that time, Versailles was no longer merely a magnificent chateau. It had become a fragrant prison of decay. Courtiers, ministers, and even commoners beyond the walls knew that behind the splendor lurked a festering ecosystem of microorganisms, yet they endured, donning scented masks and carrying small boxes of aromatic herbs, so that the two words "Le Roi" could still echo through that stifling atmosphere. Louis the Fourteenth's life had become a daily struggle between his need for self-glorification and the horror of his own hygiene. He remained unwavering in his childhood conviction. Even as his body deteriorated day by day, that mindset drove him into utter loneliness, outwardly surrounded by reverent subjects, inwardly engulfed by foul odors and unspoken pain. And there, we see the stark truth. A monarch may rule all of Europe, but he cannot rule over his own body. In January 1686, Louis entered the most tragic phase of his life. A sudden pain when he sat down turned into gangrenous hemorrhoids. At first, Louis believed it was just ordinary piles, a minor complaint common to his contemporaries. He summoned the royal physician with confidence, expecting that a bit of powder and a few acupuncture needles would cure him. Yet as the wound spread rapidly, swelling to the size of a walnut, bleeding profusely, and forming a fistula near his anus, the king began to smell a horrific stench emanating from his garments. Even foreign envoys, accustomed to higher standards of personal hygiene, turned away mid-audience to vomit. There was no time for hesitation. The first treatment applied was a succession of cold water enemas over 2,000 in just a few months, each one triggering spasms that felt like razors slicing through internal membranes. Louis endured them with grim determination, sitting on the enema chair, teeth clenched, hands gripping the gilded armrests, stifling his cries so as not to alarm his courtiers. But each enema only brought a few hours of relief before the swelling and pus returned. When enemas failed completely, the physician resorted to cauterizing the gangrenous flesh with glowing red-hot metal rods. The ivory frame of Louis's luxurious silk bed took on charred black scorch marks where the heated metal pressed. Each time the hot iron contacted his flesh, Louis moaned low, watching smoke rise from burning tissue as the acrid odor of burning flesh mixed with the stench of festering pus into a deadly perfume. He was then subjected to daily bloodletting, half a litre drawn off each time to purify his body, leaving him ever weaker. His pulse feeble, as if driven by a failing machine. Throughout these treatments, the king's screams echoed across 3 floors of the palace, causing even his most stalwart courtiers to tremble. Some younger physicians, eyes reddened from fear, secretly prayed for his recovery to spare them further horror. A few even wagered that Louis would not live to see spring. Yet, despite agony so intense, he nearly collapsed. Louis kept alive, a fire of pride and a resolve never to be conquered by illness. With enemas and cautery exhausted, surgery became the only option. Dr. Charles-François Felix, who had practiced on all manner of prisoners to hone his skills, confidently prepared to remove the gangrene. In November 1686, Louis submitted to the first operation in a daze. No anesthesia was available. All he had was a block of wood to bite down on with each incision. Dim candlelight flickered across the chamber, reflecting off the gleaming steel as his flesh was cut away. For 3 hours the operation proceeded. Blood soaked the sumptuous silk sheets, and thick grey pus filled the air with the odour of decay. 2 surgical assistants, overwhelmed, quietly stumbled out vomiting. Louis did not cry out aloud. At most a hoarse murmur escaped him. Chunks of necrotic tissue were removed, revealing blackened bone beneath the stark image of a body ravaged from within. Yet the wound did not close. Only 1 week later, the dead flesh had spread again, blackening adjacent healthy skin. With a weary sigh, Felix prepared 3 more operations over the next 3 weeks. On the 6th, the 8th, and the 12th of December, each time, Louis lay on the operating table, counting each passing minute, recalling the flickering candles of Versailles when his body had once inspired Molière's plays and Lully's compositions. In Louis's mind, physical pain mingled with the terror of losing his authority. Each time the surgeon raised his instrument, he gazed into a mirror, seeking the confident eyes of the Sunday king who once irradiated all of Europe. Instead, he saw a gaunt figure, lips ashen, eyes filled with tears. He wondered aloud, if this body decays, who am I before the world? Across those 3 consecutive weeks of surgery, Louis endured more than 20 hours under the blade. Versailles, once the ultimate symbol of power, reverberated with his pitiful cries. Courtiers whispered that the invincible king had become a suffering mass of flesh. The smell of antiseptic, of blood, and of rotting pus became his new royal attire. After the final operation, the wound temporarily closed, but Louis knew it was a fragile victory. Every step, every movement reminded him that gangrene could flare again at any moment. The demands of power would not allow him to collapse. Yet Louis's spirit grew heavier each day. In the still of night, when the palace lay silent, he would murmur, "I have fought on the battlefield, now I fight a foe deep within." This was the turning point of tragedy. A king who seemed immortal now battled daily against merciless pain. Enemas, cautery, surgery. These were mere instruments. While the agony and trauma seared themselves into Louis the XIV's soul, a stark contrast to the glory of the Versailles he had built. When the first non-surgical methods failed, Louis the XIV was forced to endure unprecedented major operations. In November 1686, Dr. Charles-François Felix, after months of practicing on prisoners, performed the very first surgery in the king's private chambers. There was no anesthesia, only a wooden block for Louis to clench between his teeth as the scalpel flashed and carved deep into the necrotic flesh for 3 uninterrupted hours. Fresh blood spattered across the silk sheets. Thick pus stank of decay, and 2 surgical assistants fainted and had to leave the room. The moment the first operation ended, the wound did not heal, but instead deepened and spread. Felix was compelled to perform 3 more surgeries within a mere 3 weeks to remove all the dead tissue. On December the 6th, the 8th, and finally, the 12th each, lasting from 3 to 6 hours, dozens of litres of pus were drained, as rotted muscle flaked away in chunks, even exposing the necrotic shin bone. Contemporary witnesses recalled, the emperor's screams echoed through 3 floors, more terrifying than any battlefield. In every operation, Felix employed a specially curved listorial scalpel, boiled in wine for sterilization before cutting. When the red-hot metal touched living tissue, Louis would flinch, yet he stifled all sound to preserve his dignity. The acrid smell of burning flesh mingled with the fetid odor of pus, forcing the court physicians to change their gloves and perfumed masks every half hour. Over 20 doctors participated, many of whom publicly wagered their own lives on the success of these surgeries. Outside the tightly closed doors, courtiers trembled at the sound of flesh being sliced, and the emperor's ragged moans. Young nobles often shuddered at the faint cries drifting down from above. One even whispered, "His wails strike the heart more fiercely than cannon fire." Yet none dared protest. A single public objection could mean disgrace or death. After each major operation, Louis was carried back to his convalescent chamber, where velvet drapes stained with dark blood hid the carnage. He lay motionless for hours, eyes squeezed shut, lips pressed tight, struggling to conceal the horror gnawing at his body. Occasionally he would murmur, forcing down a dose of mild soporific that the physicians administered to dull the pain. Louis's mind grew increasingly tormented. The fear of spreading gangrene and the pressure to maintain the invincible image of the Sunday king warred within him. Each morning, he awoke to bandaged wounds and asked himself, "Can I move today without crying out?" That anxiety left him sleepless, his gaze drifting across the gilded walls without recognition. Only after 4 major operations totaling over 20 hours of surgery did the wound finally close, albeit temporarily. Yet every step and every motion reminded him that the dead tissue lay ready to erupt again. He realized, with painful clarity, that contemporary medicine could not fully save him. That grim truth drove another wedge into the pride of a king who had refused to admit he could be defeated. During those grueling 3 weeks, the Palace of Versailles lost some of its former luster. The laughter, the regal strides, the 6-hour ballets all gave way to the tremulous footsteps, guiding the king to the operating table, and his anguished cries echoing down the corridors. State banquets continued, but courtiers sipped wine in silence, wary of the smell of antiseptic, mingled with rotting pus and expensive roses. Gradually, Louis abandoned the illusion of bodily divinity. Each time he looked in the mirror, he saw the once majestic monarch reduced to a gaunt, pale figure with bulging, pained eyes. The stark contrast between his opulent robes and Versailles' splendor and the open wound, the stench, the agony beneath, plunged him into an existential crisis. In the end, Louis faced 2 options: accept a life journey in a ravaged body, or abandon his throne to focus on healing. Absolute monarchical authority would not let him relinquish his crown. Yet his body's betrayal only deepened his isolation. On December nights, by flickering candlelight, he would murmur, "I have conquered fortresses abroad, but now the fortress within defeats me." Thus Louis the 14th, who once proclaimed, "I am the state," now depended on a physician's scalpel. His loyal courtiers, though steadfast, could not help but long for the days of his glory. And when the final surgery concluded, Versailles resounded not only with golden triumph, but with a mournful toll, the end of his radiant era and the dark beginning of his final months. After 4 major surgeries, any hope of recovery suddenly died out. Louis the 14th had to live with a permanent aftermath, a gangrenous fistula between his anus and lower abdomen, continuously oozing pus and feces. According to court records, the king's bandages had to be changed 3 times a day, each change a horrific spectacle of stench, and the creaking of the makeshift bed carriage rolling through the palace. The foul odor would surge as the physicians removed the dressings, spreading like wildfire and forcing Louis's attendants to suck on peppermint lozenges to mask it. Even lavish perfumes and continuous herbal fumigations at Versailles could not hide this gruesome reality. To conceal the revulsion, Versailles issued a color-coded ceremonial protocol. A red ribbon signified that the emperor was enduring excruciating pain, and all guests were required to wear scented masks. A white ribbon permitted approach, but mandated a perfumed kerchief around the neck. A black ribbon warned of the worst days, when all contact was strictly forbidden. This system turned the royal court into a labyrinth of ritual, where ladies, in-waiting and high officials had to memorize dozens of signals to avoid standing in the wrong place and catching the king's odor. Despite every effort to cut off the spread, the discharge continued to seep under his skin, soaking through his silk garments and drenching the velvet curtains. With each step Louis took, the damp stain at his hip reminded him, this pain cannot be buried. He repeatedly petitioned Felix for more surgery to excise deeper tissue and graft in fresh flesh, but the surgeon refused. Every operation only caused healthy tissue to die, causing the wound to expand and the king's flesh to become ever more disfigured. In desperation, the court physicians resorted to noxious fumigations and royal-style acupuncture, hoping to soothe the pain and purge toxins. Instead, hours of smoke inhalation only stifled Louis further. Courtiers later whispered, "The choking smoke envelops the king, scorching his flesh like fire. Ultimately, the court only responded to the horror with a facade of majestic integration, applying bright cosmetics and adjusting candlelight to obscure the wound. In the end, the disease did not stop at the gangrenous fistula, but became an indelible mark on the Sunday King's body. Louis watched his divine image and power erode layer by layer of his flesh. Each time he sat upon his throne, his courtiers' eyes showed pity and fear. They no longer saw an invincible monarch, but a man torn apart by relentless agony. Louis's psyche grew more unsettled by the day. When he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw the radiant glow of power, but only the ravaged shell of his body. In the solitude of night, he would ask himself, if even this body betrays me, what meaning does the throne retain? That question cut into his pride like a blade, leaving the Sunday King, once celebrated across Europe, bathed now in loneliness and shame. From then on, Versailles stood not only as a symbol of supreme authority, but as a vivid testament to the limits of human flesh. The opulent ceremonies, the grand theatrical displays, and the countless pages of court protocol could not erase the stench of decay or the echo of moans across the great hall. Louis the Fourteenth, who once proclaimed, "I am the state," ultimately realized that absolute power could not conquer a mortal body. When the initial non-surgical measures failed, Louis the Fourteenth was forced to submit to unprecedented major operations. In November of 1686, Dr. Charles-François Felix, after many months of practice on prisoners, performed the very first surgery in the king's private chambers. There was no anesthesia, only a wooden block for Louis to bite, as the blade flashed and carved deeply into the necrotic tissue for a full 3 hours. Fresh blood spattered across the silk sheets. Thick pus steamed with the stench of decay, and 2 assistants fainted and had to leave the room. The moment the first operation ended, the wound did not heal, but instead grew deeper and wider. Felix was compelled to carry out 3 more surgeries within the next 3 weeks to remove all the dead tissue. On December the 6th, the 8th, and the 10th each procedure, lasting from 3 to 6 hours, dozens of litres of pus were drained as chunks of rotted flesh flaked away, exposing even the decayed shin bone. Contemporary witnesses recalled, the emperor's screams echoed through 3 floors, more terrifying than any battlefield. With each surgery, Felix used his specially curved listorial scalpel, boiled in wine for sterilization, before cutting into the king's flesh. When the red-hot metal contacted living tissue, Louis would flinch, yet stifled all sound to preserve his dignity. The acrid odour of burning flesh mingled with the fetid stench of pus throughout the chamber, forcing the court physicians to change their gloves and perfumed masks every half hour. More than 20 doctors took part, some even wagering publicly that their lives depended on the operation's success. Outside the closed doors, courtiers trembled at the sound of flesh being sliced and the emperor's hoarse moans. Many young nobles shuddered at the faint cries drifting down 3 flights of stairs. One whispered. His wails gripped the heart more fiercely than cannon fire. Yet none dared complain. One public objection could mean disgrace or even execution. After each major procedure, Louis was carried back to his convalescent quarters, where velvet drapes stitched with gold hid the bloodstains. He lay motionless for hours, eyes squeezed shut, lips pressed tight, concealing the horror devouring his body. Occasionally he would murmur, forcing down a dose of mild soporific to dull the pain. Louis's mind grew ever more tormented, caught between the terror of spreading gangrene and the pressure to uphold the image of the invincible Sunday King. Each morning, he woke to bandaged wounds and wondered, "Can I move today without crying out?" That fear haunted his sleep, his gaze drifting blankly over the gilded walls. Only after 4 major operations totaling more than 20 hours of surgery did the wound finally close, albeit temporarily. Yet every step and every movement reminded him that the necrosis could resurge at any moment. He realized, with painful clarity, that contemporary medicine could not fully save him. That truth struck his pride like a fresh wound, cutting deep into a monarch who would not admit defeat. During those tense 3 weeks, the Palace of Versailles lost some of its former luster. The laughter, the regal strides, the 6-hour ballets all gave way to shaky footsteps, guiding the king to the operating table, and anguished cries echoing through the hallways. State banquets continued, but courtiers sipped their wine in silence, wary of the mingled scents of antiseptic, rotting pus, and lavish perfumes. Gradually, Louis abandoned the illusion of bodily divinity. Each time he looked in the mirror, he saw only a gaunt, ashen figure with bulging, pained eyes. The stark contrast between his opulent robes and the reality beneath open wounds, stench, and unrelenting agony plunged him into an existential crisis. In the end, Louis faced 2 choices: accept a life confined to a ravaged body, or renounce his throne to focus on healing. Absolute monarchical authority would not allow him to relinquish his crown. Yet his body's betrayal deepened his isolation. On December nights, by flickering candlelight, he would whisper, "I have conquered forts abroad. Now the fortress within defeats me." Thus Louis the 14th, once declaring, "I am the state," now relied on a surgeon's skill. His loyal courtier, though steadfast, quietly mourned the loss of the golden era. And when the final surgery concluded, Versailles resounded not only with its gilded majesty but also with a mournful toll marking the dark turning point of the king's final months. After 4 major surgeries, any hope of recovery abruptly vanished. Louis the 14th was forced to live with a permanent consequence, a gangrenous fistula between his anus and the lower abdominal skin, continuously oozing pus and feces. According to palace records, the king had to have his bandages changed 3 times a day, each change a horrific spectacle of billowing stench mingled with the creaking of the makeshift bed carriage rolling through the chambers. The foul odor would surge the moment the physicians removed the dressings, spreading like a cloud of toxic smoke, and forcing the king's attendants to suck on peppermint lozenges all day to mask the smell. Once it became impossible to hide, Versailles issued a color-coded ceremonial protocol. A red ribbon pinned to one's collar signified that the emperor was enduring excruciating pain. Immediately, all guests were required to wear perfumed masks. A white ribbon permitted approach, but mandated a perfumed handkerchief tied around the neck. A black ribbon announced the worst days no contact was allowed under any circumstances. This system turned the royal court into a labyrinth of ceremony and color, where ladies, in waiting, and the high nobility had to memorize dozens of signals simply to avoid standing in the wrong place and catching the king's stench. Despite every effort by the court to conceal the truth, the discharge continued to spread beneath the skin, soaking through the king's luxurious silk attire and drenching the gold-trimmed velvet drapes. The image of Louis, once majestically seated on his throne, was now marred by damp stains at his waistline. A constant reminder, this disease cannot be buried. He repeatedly petitioned Felix for further surgery to excise all necrotic tissue and graft new flesh, but the surgeon stubbornly refused. Each operation, though it removed part of the dead tissue, inevitably harmed the surrounding healthy flesh, causing the wound to widen. In desperation, the court resorted to foul-smelling fumigations. Iron braziers filled the room with choking, acrid smoke. They followed with red-hot metal applications to purge heat from the wound, and royal-style acupuncture, with long needles inserted into points around the lower abdomen. Yet hours of smoke only suffocated Louis further. The billowing fumes enveloped him like a deadly net, leaving his skin even more parched and irritated. Courtiers murmured. The choking smoke envelops the king, as though he burns alive in a dungeon. Oh, with no other choice, the court resorted to majestic integration to deceive the public, applying bright rouge, repainting his brows, adjusting candlelight to cast flattering shadows, and ordering the palace orchestra to play majestic fanfares to drown out the reality of disease. Versailles became a grand stage for deception. Dozens of fresh flower baskets positioned throughout the hall to mask the smell. Cavalry units firing salutes noisily at the king's appearances, all intended to distract visitors from the horrifying reality behind the curtains. In the end, the disease did not stop at the gangrenous fistula, but became an indelible mark on the Sunday king's body. The image of Louis, once so regal, now ended in a gaunt silhouette, sunken cheeks, and lips that never closed against the flow of pus. Every time he sat on his throne, his courtiers' eyes revealed a mixture of pity and fear. They no longer saw an invincible monarch, but a man torn apart by relentless agony. Louis's psyche grew increasingly shattered. When he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw the halo of power, only a body ravaged by illness. In solitary nights, he would often ask himself, if even this body betrays me, does the throne still hold any meaning? That question cut into his pride like a blade, leaving the Sunday king, once celebrated across Europe, now drowned in loneliness and shame. From that point on, Versailles stood not only as a symbol of supreme authority, but as a vivid testament to the limits of human flesh. The lavish ceremonies, the magnificent theatricals, and the thousand solemn footsteps could not erase the stench of decay or the echo of moans throughout the great hall. Louis the Fourteenth, who once declared, "I am the state," ultimately realized that absolute power could not conquer a mortal body. Unable to overcome the persistent stench, Louis the Fourteenth decided to launch the most extravagant perfume campaign in human history. He approved an annual expenditure, equivalent to $2 million in today's value, solely to bring into the Palace of Versailles baskets of freshly fragrant Bulgarian roses, strings of rare Arabian agarwood, and the heady scent of Indian sandalwood. Throughout the grand halls, 500 bronze censers and 500 pots of fresh flowers were neatly arranged, replaced every 2 hours to suppress the foul odor. In addition, 50 scented mist machines operated 24 hours a day, releasing thin, intoxicating clouds that drifted through corridors and meeting rooms. Under the emperor's orders, royal consorts and ladies in waiting were required to wear specially designed perfume masks before being allowed to enter the palace. Every courtier, regardless of rank, reluctantly accepted being swathed in layers of oil-infused cloth to avoid being overwhelmed by the stench. Yet, no matter the effort, the foul smell would inevitably return whenever the censers burned out or the flowers wilted before the scheduled replacement. It was not only the odor. Louis's body also suffered the consequences of repeated surgeries and prolonged immobility. In just 30 years, his weight shot up from 75 kilograms to 140 kilograms. Fat accumulated all over his body, leaving him unable to mount a horse on his own. Whenever he wished to go hunting, 6 courtiers had to lift him onto the saddle. His gilded wooden throne, inlaid with precious metals and once used in its original form, had to be rebuilt 3 times to bear the king's ever-expanding frame. The royal painter worked under pressure to alter portraits, depicting Louis only from a side angle to conceal his darkened, bloated belly bound in layers of costly silk. Meanwhile, foreign ambassadors made no effort to hide their astonishment and disdain. The Russian ambassador openly scoffed. "His fragrance is sharper than the smell of my horse." The remark quickly spread across Paris and Vienna, becoming a notorious tale in diplomatic circles about the Sunday king undone by his own excess. Versailles, once a dazzling stage for power and art, now bore witness to the emperor's body staggering under the twin forces of decay and overindulgence. The violins at banquets no longer sang with crystalline clarity, but merely laid a thin musical veil over the hazy air, where the fading scent of roses mingled with the reek of sweat. Amid the gilded rooms, guests had to weave their way like travellers in a maze, avoiding puddles that gathered at the royal feet. At each court audience, Louis reclined on his throne, his bulky figure like a carved wooden statue, surrounded by censers and arrays of flowers. The flickering candlelight barely illuminated the slender silhouettes of masked consorts, standing firm before the walking corpse king. The royal guards, once proud, spear-bearing sentinels at his side, now dared only to stand hundreds of paces away, unwilling to face the full force of the toxic air that drifted from the remnants of his illness. And yet, Louis the XIV refused to yield. He continued to hold regular audiences, ordered grand military parades, and hosted opulent banquets. Everything was meticulously staged to project power. But the people had already perceived the absurd truth. Behind the gilded facade lay a fragile body, always on the verge of breakdown and decay. In the end, the colossal perfume campaign could not conceal the stench forever. The foul odour still crept through door cracks, and oil-infused steel could not halt the spread of disease. Versailles, once magnificent, now carried the imprint of horror. A royal palace where power and excess walked hand in hand, only to erode the body of a king who fancied himself immortal. In August of 1715, the Palace of Versailles awoke not to the sound of ceremonial drums or the sweet strains of violin, but to the piercing scream of Louis the XIV. At that time the king was 77 years old, yet he had never seemed so fragile. Early in the morning, he sprang from his gilded bed and tried to take a step, only to collapse immediately from excruciating pain radiating from his hip, down through his left buttock and leg. His scream rent the air and sent physicians and attendants scurrying to his side. Old Dr. Fagin, who had tended Louis for decades, hurried to examine him and made a simple diagnosis. "Your Majesty suffers from sciatica, a common nervous complaint in old age." He prescribed a course of muscle-relaxant remedies and advised the king to rest for an extra 2 hours each afternoon. Louis, despite his agony, managed a reluctant nod. Yet just a few days later, strange dark spots began to spread from the tip of his big toe, the blotches racing up to his ankle, and then his calf. The nerve pain did not ease. Instead, it grew more violent, as if thousands of needles of white-hot steel were driven through his flesh. As the necrotic patches emerged, a horrifying stench rose, filling all 3 floors of the palace. The fetid odour was so potent that the unaccustomed could scarcely breathe. Pellerin, an attendant renowned for his fortitude, fainted upon first entering the king's chamber. Ladies in waiting, foreign ambassadors, and even the palace guards regularly stepped back, pinching their noses, some collapsing at the threshold in a sudden swoon. At last, Fagin realized his grievous error. This was not sciatica but dry gangrene, a life-threatening condition. The king's body took on a grim aspect. His limbs grew numb, his skin blackened and shriveled, dry. Scaly carbuncles peeled away to reveal bone and tendon, like rotten cloth pinned to living flesh. Each step Louis took seemed to drag a corpse behind him. He forced himself upright on the throne, his once regal bearing reduced to a shuddering puppet of wood and rot. Despite the torment, Louis refused to yield. With trembling hand, he signed decrees upon his ivory desk, his signature jagged, his eyes glistening with helpless tears. His fingers, curled like reeds in a storm, still clenched the quill with resolute strength. He issued military orders, commanding his troops to continue their drills. Even as beads of blood-tinged sweat dripped down his gaunt frame, amidst his agony, Louis convened a council of foreign emissaries, those envoys who had come to negotiate alliances and truces, recoiled in horror at the scene. There sat the king upon his throne, his legs black and numb, flesh peeling in necrotic patches, a miasma of decay suffusing the chamber. They donned perfumed masks and stood 3 paces back to hear his pronouncements. The slightest echo through the doorway, enough to chill their blood. This spectacle was unprecedented. The most powerful sovereign in Europe teetering on the brink of life and death, shaking the very foundations of his court. Attendants clutched the throne's arms, fearing even a tremor might topple the king. The hammer of state sessions struck off, beat, and the palace bell summoned ministers to a shortened audience so that the monarch could retreat to his dressing room. In that brief interlude, Louis gazed around Versailles, once resounding with laughter, and praise now redolent only of rot and the aghast faces of his courtiers. He wondered, "I have ruled many lands, but how much longer can this body hold the throne?" The pain coursed through him like live wires, each movement pushing him further toward oblivion. Fagin, now admitting his mistake, hastened to prepare new treatments, yet every medical measure failed. Muscle relaxants, disinfectant salves, even warm mineral soaks, none could halt the spread of dry gangrene. The court was reduced to prayers at the private chapel, imploring divine mercy for a king who teetered on the edge of the grave. Finally, Louis the 14th, who once declared, "I and the state are one," slipped away behind his curtains. The closing of his chamber door sounded like the drop of a coffin lid. Versailles fell silent once more, leaving only the faint echo of a dying breath and the haunting solitude of the final hours. In the early evening of the first day of August, in the grip of high fever and delirium, Louis the 14th summoned his grandson, the young Duke of Anjou, to his gilded bedside. His eyes were dim, yet a final spark of lucidity remained. The king grasped the boy's hand and whispered in a weak but earnest voice, "Do not follow my example. I loved war too much, and my body has paid the highest price." Those were his last coherent words before the dry gangrene that ravaged his flesh stole his ability to speak. The proud voice of the once mighty Sunday king became a cautionary echo to all who thirst for power. At 7 o'clock on the 1st of September, the heart of the Sunday king finally ceased its beat. An oppressive silence fell over Versailles. Yet Louis's corpse continued to decay with astonishing speed. Within hours of his death, maggots swarmed his gangrenous wounds, their pale bodies writhing through every fissure of rotting skin. A dank miasma of death permeated the palace, overwhelming even the most precious perfumes arrayed in his honor. A swift autopsy was conducted immediately afterward in the royal examination chamber, lit by flickering candles and shrouded in faded velvet drapes. The royal physician and 2 foreign doctors hastily inspected the body. They recorded that from the left hip joint upward to the crown of the head, half of Louis's left side was completely gangrenous. His muscle tissue and skin were as soft as waterlogged parchment, and the stench intensified upon contact. When they opened his abdomen, they discovered intestines twice their normal length, harboring a colossal tapeworm coiled within, its fractured head segments immersed in murky pus. The embalming process that followed was a tragedy beyond imagining. Six attendants, wearing perfumed masks and thick gloves, labored continuously for 2 days and nights. They packed his wounds with sea salt, seared them with potent brandy, and applied aromatic pastes to each necrotic flap. The resulting odor, a nauseating blend of embalmment chemicals and decay, forced even the stoutest physicians to clutch their bellies in retching dismay. The autopsy report was drafted in haste, then promptly sealed and buried deep within the royal archives to prevent any leak. For nearly 2 centuries it lay hidden until it was finally deciphered in 1891, revealing the full horror of the Sunday King's death. Louis the 14th's ultimate legacy was not only his sweeping policies, the splendor of Versailles, or his patronage of the arts, but also a chilling lesson on the limits of mortal flesh. However absolute the power, however gilded the throne, the human body must bow to birth, age, disease, and death. The image of the proud monarch ascending the throne with eyes bright as shooting stars now survives only in history books, marked indelibly by gangrene's ravages, his agony, and the unrelenting stench of decay. Louis the 14th, who once proclaimed, "I am the state," at last learned that no earthly authority can conquer the most relentless laws of nature. From early in the year 1715, Louis the Fourteenth continued to govern France with grim determination. Even though every movement felt as though it were being squeezed by waves of agony, his chronic sciatica suddenly transformed into dry gangrene, dark. Bruised spots appeared at the tip of his big toe, spreading up to his ankle and down to his calf. Skin peeled away in thick flakes, revealing jagged bone, like rotting wood. The royal physicians warned that unless the diseased tissue were amputated, the gangrene would march up to his hip, threatening the king's very life. The pressure of the moment was unbearable. A radical surgery might save his leg, but would shatter the image of the Sunday king as invincible. Yet the idea of joint disarticulation or leg amputation was never publicly entertained. In part, this was due to Louis's belief that God had conferred his power directly to the monarch. How could a son of heaven ever cut off his own limb? In part, it stemmed from fear. Should the rumour spread, the king's legendary reputation and absolute authority would collapse. Discussions of amputation were whispered only behind closed doors. By candlelight, as court physicians exchanged hushed words, within the blazing gilt walls of Versailles, courtiers strove to maintain the grand facade of diplomatic power, ensuring that whispers of the king's gangrenous limb never reached the ears of the outside world. In his final days, Louis sat upon his grey throne, issuing decrees to the court with a trembling hand. He signed critical edicts, but could scarcely summon the clarity to absorb even a few responses. Relying on his secretaries to record and relay incoming dispatches, reports from Italy's battlefields and new tax returns were funneled through his aides, for the king's mind no longer possessed the sharpness to parse them. Still, lawsuits, domestic policies, and foreign treaties proceeded unceasingly, testament to the fact that royal power refused to capitulate, even as its bearer's body disintegrated. Yet Louis could not escape the relentless assaults of pain. High fevers racked him day and night. Delirium haunted his sleep. His body trembled whenever summoned. On one occasion, he wished to appear at the balcony window for a ceremony. But when he rose, 2 chamberlains had to support him like they carried a splintering wooden statue. His heels cracked open. His anal fistula drenched his clothes in blood, and gangrene crept farther up his calf, so dire that he repeatedly confided to his physician, "I have endured worse battles than this." These words, at once bearing steel resolve and profound despair, revealed the vulnerability of the invincible king in his last hours. Subsequent audiences resembled a tragic play. Louis sat in solemn silence beside a vase of flowers, his face etched with suffering, hands trembling upon a carved wooden table. Guests tiptoed across the Persian carpet, keeping their distance so as not to disturb the wounded flesh. The ceremonial gavel sounded in halting rhythms, as though pausing for breath. Court musicians still performed violin pieces, but the melodies grew sombre, mingling with the scent of paraffin and antiseptic. Louis's mind teetered between memories of past glory and the reality of his mutilated flesh. He often gazed at his youthful portrait eyes, bright as shooting stars, a resolute countenance, and then turned to his own reflection, a gaunt figure, calves bandaged, dark circles around bleary eyes. Each glance in the mirror prompted the question, is the price of power worth the ruin of this body? The contrast between once illustrious splendor and present cruelty deepened the king's disillusionment. Nevertheless, Louis persisted in issuing decrees. He ordered an autumn festival to rally public morale, granted ducal patents, and approved plans for new roads and bridges. Each directive bore his name, marking the final assertion of his authority before his body wholly failed him. It was said that after each meeting, the king would slump forward, sighing deeply, eyes closed, as if seeking an escape from his unending torment. Day by day, Louis lapsed into near paralysis, unable to sit upright, unaided. He leaned back against the gilded cushion, legs drawn up, hands gripping his iron staff. Every passing moment became a battle between his indomitable spirit and his betraying flesh. Those who once worshipped the Sunday King now saw only an old man hunched and hobbling through the shadow of Versailles. Finally, when he closed his eyes, Louis the 14th believed he had fulfilled his mission: to uphold the throne, to preserve the realm, even at the cost of his ravaged body. The courtiers heartbroken, though they were bowed in farewell to the fallen sovereign who had once captivated Europe with his valour and genius. The account of his final days remains a poignant epic. Absolute power cannot conceal mortal suffering, and even the strongest will eventually succumb to the immutable cycle of life. Aging, illness, and death. On the first day of September, 1715, Louis summoned his grandson into the chamber. With his final, feeble breath, he whispered, "Do not foolishly pursue war as I did." These were his last coherent words before the dry gangrene overtook his ability to speak. The necrosis reached his throat muscles, leaving him unable to distinguish a cry of pain from a greeting. At 7 o'clock on the morning of the 2nd, the heart of the Sunday King ceased its beat, yet his body continued to decay even after death. The rancid gases of decomposition rose with the steam from his garments, forcing the ladies of the court and officials to don perfumed masks before entering the mortuary chamber. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the corpse had swollen to 1.5 times its living size, skin peeling away in sheets. And during the emergency autopsy, the intestines revealed a gigantic tapeworm protruding in the examination room. The post-mortem examination was kept secret until 1891. When the report was finally released, it described a terrifying scene: distorted eyes, blackened skin, and a stench of decay, so potent it matched any battlefield cadaver. The body was swiftly embalmed and sealed in lead to contain the toxic gases. More than 20 assistants toiled through the night, wearing sandalwood masks and Indian incense blends to endure the odour. The state funeral was conducted with full ceremony. A gilded coffin departed the palace, escorted in a procession that stretched along the Grand Avenue to the Saint-Denis cemetery. The populace stood in solemn silence before this scene, both dignified and horrifying. Many wept openly upon beholding Louis's final portrait, once a figure of divine majesty, now laid bare as a mortal shell, rotting and reclaimed by death. Louis the 14th left behind for future generations a harsh lesson: absolute power cannot grant immortality, and no matter how splendid the body, it cannot escape the relentless cycle of disease and decay. He did not merely construct palaces that astonished Europe, he also initiated a policy of centralized authority, establishing an absolute monarchy revered for centuries. Yet in the end, the Sunday King had to live with horrific gangrenous wounds and spend a fortune equivalent to $2 million per year in today's value, simply to fill his court with floral scents and perfumed vapours to mask the stench of death rising each day. The legacy Louis left his descendants was not only grand statues, magnificent fountains, or a network of loyal officials. It was also the image of a depleted monarch who relied on expensive perfumes and colourful ribbon rituals to conceal the shame of a ravaged body. The Palace of Versailles, once the epitome of supreme power and crafted beauty, became a cold testament to the unstoppable ravages of illness. Louis's grandchildren: Louis, Duke of Burgundy; Philip, future King of Spain; and Charles, Duke of Berry, grew up under the dark shadow of their grandfather's final years. Each of them would come to ask the same haunting question: how does one preserve a noble spirit when the flesh is so vulnerable to the ravages of disease? Louis's eldest grandson, Louis the Duke of Burgundy, later tempered his ambition with caution, perhaps determined not to repeat the tragedy that consumed his grandfather's body. Philip, who became Philip V of Spain, carried the Bourbon name across Europe, yet often pondered the fragile boundary between power and mortality. Charles, Duke of Berry, though he died young, left contemporaries lamenting what might have been had he witnessed. How physical collapse can echo like an alarm bell through a dynasty. Historians agree that, had Louis the Fourteenth not fallen into that nightmare of gangrene and infirmity, the Bourbon dynasty might have shone even more brilliantly. Yet his physical demise remains the starkest reminder that no mortal, however powerful, can escape the immutable laws of birth, aging, sickness, and death. In his final days, feats and glory became illusions, yielding to ever-increasing physical pain. At every court session, Louis still tried to sign decrees and issue edicts, though his trembling fingers and dimming gaze no longer possessed the clarity to make weighty decisions. Instead, he relied on ministers and secretaries to record his commands, ensuring that his authority outlasted the weakening shell of his body. These efforts were but relics of once grand power. Now, faint imprints in a gilt room heavy with the scent of antiseptics and wilting flowers. Ultimately, the Sunday King ended his earthly journey in a state of bodily decomposition. Dry gangrene spread across his limbs. His intestines teemed with maggots, and the decay never ceased. On the day he drew his last breath, Versailles ceased to be a centre of light and music and became a silent night, filled only with the smell of herbs and the quiet footsteps of perfumed servants. His funeral cortege passed through the courtyards to Saint-Denis amid mournful silence, reminding everyone that even the golden days of any dynasty must come to an end. This is not merely a royal tale, but a profound reminder for us, modern readers. No matter how great one's power, health and humanity are the true guides for life. Do not wait until disease knocks at your door, when body and spirit must endure unspeakable suffering to scramble for a cure. Treasure every breath, every heartbeat, and take time to care for yourself before power. No matter how vast becomes meaningless in the face of time's and illness's unrelenting destruction. And thus concludes our journey through the life of Louis the Fourteenth. From the pinnacle of power to his final days, ravaged by horrific illness. This video not only recreates a chapter of history both glorious and dark, but also delivers a profound message. No matter how dazzling power and fame may be, they cannot triumph over the laws of nature: birth, aging, sickness, and death. Health and humanity are the true core values each of us must protect. From the tale of the Sunday King, undone by gangrene, we learn that caring for our bodies and minds is never superfluous. In today's fast-paced, high-pressure world, take the time to rest. Schedule regular health checkups and show concern for yourself and those around you. A short vacation, a workout session, or simply an earnest conversation can restore the balance needed to move forward with confidence. This video also reminds us that history is full of invaluable lessons. Every king, every general, every cultural figure has a story, one that shines with glory but also hides pain and naked truth. We would love to hear your thoughts. Which historical figure intrigues you most? Whom you'd like us to explore next? Leave a comment below with the names of the people or historical periods you love. Your suggestion might become the subject of our next exciting and informative video. Thank you for watching until the very end. Wishing you a truly good night, so your sleep can wash away fatigue and renew your energy for tomorrow. If you found this video helpful and engaging, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell. You'll never miss our newest and best videos yet to come. Once again, sleep well, and we'll see you in our next fascinating historical adventure.